Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 51 with Jon Peterson. What was the first RPG? Hint, it ain't what you think.
Greetings once and all again, internet. It is I, Ben Riggs, D&D historian, but I am a mere insect at the feet of the man who I share this podcast
What?
with today. And I've already made him uncomfortable. I'm sure it will only get worse from here, as we have the Thucydides of the field, Jon Peterson here today. Jon Peterson, author of multiple books that I believe have been on the New York Times bestseller list in the realm of D&D history. He's been on what was the show you were on?
I'm sorry. What do you
You,
what do you mean?
sorry, you were on a TV show for D&D. What weren't you? Heroes
Oh, so
Feast?
yeah, the Heroes Feast cookbook series. One of my proudest accomplishments, the small role I played in getting the, as you pointed out, to everyone's surprise, New York Times best-selling Heroes Feast book series kicked off. That did lead indeed to a television show. Of which we shot many episodes out in Burbank, where people cooked various dishes from it. You can go find these episodes. I cannot claim that I am a scintillating television personality. I will say that when, they had the author team on to prepare one of the dishes from Heroes Feast, we chose the tavern stew, which is pretty much the most brain dead thing you could possibly do. And my contribution was actually cutting vegetables. I did cut some carrots, and then they went into a pot. We cooked it. Of course, this through the reductive magic of television, they had, of course, already prepared the actual tavern stew, right? Because in our filming schedule, we didn't have time to cook it, and so we then ate a much better rendition of the tavern stew that I'm sure that the author team, had furnished.
Disbelief shattered. Um,
Yes.
but man, when I think about your name, the thing that still pops to mind is playing at the World. Um, and To people who don't know John and don't know playing at the World, uh, playing at the World in many ways created the field of D&D history in the 21st century. Um, Others have come after. Uh, Everyone has put John in their bibliography, because his work just again laid down a road for others to follow. Um, and did that come out in 2011, 2012?
2012.
Yeah, so you came out before fifth edition. It came out before anyone had any idea that there was going to be a D&D boom between 2014 and I don't know, 2023, call it what you will. Um, so when I started writing my book, it was after I'd had several years of writing for Geek and Sundry, and I kind of saw what was happening, and it was a topic that engaged me, and I'm like, hey, D&D's hot right now. It's a topic that engages me. Here I go. I'm going to write a book. But you wrote your book in the winter of D&D. At a trough in the game's popularity, and I don't know the story of of that book's creation or publication. So I'd love to hear the story of the making of that book, uh, from your point of view. And I should say to the audience, so Playing at the World, good Lord, covers the creation of D&D most importantly, in detail using incredible primary source material. But again, it expands beyond that topic, and I'm going to stop talking now and let John tell us that story.
Yeah, I mean, there are lot of facets you kind of touched on there. I mean, I guess the first I revisit is it was, as you say, a trough, in the sense, th this was a time when games like World of Warcraft, which I played obsessively when it came out, were ascendant, and it was unclear that tabletop role-playing games really had a material future beyond something very niche, beyond, the interest of a few hardened traditionalists, the same kind of people who don't just watch laser discs, but want to watch, things on Betamax, right? Like that level of, kind of fetishistic appreciation for, a bygone pastime. But it was a bygone pastime I was really into at the same time that, I was playing WoW. I was running then third edition and 3.5. And I was really kind of steeped in all of this. But the origin story that I've told a few times about how Playing at the World really got started is I become like so obsessed with WoW, which came out in November of 2004, that early in 2005, some friends of mine staged something of an intervention, and we all went to England to go to an indie rock festival in the kind of southern coast of England in the winter in February. Not a good time to visit England, by the way, especially not the beaches there. But while we were there, we stopped off in London and we're in the British Museum, and I happened to see in a display case there one of these now quite famous on the internet, first century AD Roman 20-sided dice. And I was like, okay. And there were several other kind of polyhedra in this display case, and I just had this moment where I was like, I mean, how far back does all of this go? All this stuff in WoW, all this base like technology, and the maybe the first real question I formulated was like, who was it? There must have been a point in history where someone like rolled an implement of chance against a table of probability to determine whether or not a fictional event happened. What was that? That seemed like that was a recoverable moment. And so that's what I first, just out of my own curiosity, started trying to like read up on. I read a lot of books about history of probability, the history of games, and I didn't really find people that were poking at exactly the questions I thought were interesting. Obviously, I was also very interested in experience systems and how the concept of going up in level, came about. Things like how hit points and armor class and concepts like that originated, because all this tech seemed to just underlie everything that had become now this massive worldwide phenomena. The people playing Skyrim, the people playing WoW, take your pick of the kind of AAA RPGs. And so yeah, that's I just started writing about it, started reading about it, writing about it.
Wow. And uh, how many words was the first edition?
I think it was 420,000.
My God.
Longer than War and Peace in Russian. Russian's more compact than English. I think English translations of War and Peace are tend to be a little larger, but
And again, for our audience, what was the scope of playing at the world?
well, I mean, it cast a wide net, the widest net that I could possibly, contrive. It was trying to find all of the conceptual threads that seemed to make the emergence of D&D possible. What were all of the things that were prerequisites for it and influences on it that were precursors, that were parallels, that were kind of part of the story of how those technical pieces, things like the experience system, the combat system, the fantasy elements of it, like where did they all come from? That this concept of like inhabiting the mind of a fictional person and like being able to voice actions for them and to have someone respond with what the results were of this thing that you voiced as an intention. And so I just went deep on all of the sources, and some very proximate, some that we know the authors of D&D knew directly and interacted with directly, some that went back hundreds of years, where, through multiple intermediaries, they descended down to the original authors of D&D. But I think, perhaps most importantly, and if there's a point to Playing at the World, and you know, it's not a show about nothing, but it's definitely not something that has a tight argument, as you'd ordinarily expect from like, a academic monograph. But if there is a point to it, it's that, D&D was part of a movement, I guess. And, what I'm trying to show in this book is the breadth of that movement, is who the other players were who were accessing kind of at least the same set of requirements and producing things that were adjacent, and kind of trying to identify what are the things that made D&D unique in that milieu, and what were the things that were in fact quite commonplace to the people that were versed in this at the time.
Wow. Well, I think I'm going to go with the most natural follow-up there, which is the thing that sparked me having you on the show was to talk about what the first role-playing game was, because
Hmm.
for me, um, I remember sometime in the 90s having someone describe to me Gary Gygax playing D&D with his kids. And in my mind I'm like, "Oh, what a cute way for D&D to start." Like a novelist telling a story to their kids at bedtime that they write, and it goes on to be a bestseller. And then, I read I think it was Designers and Dragons that I hit next, and I was like, oh, okay, so Dave Arneson, Blackmoor, and Braunstein. And again, to people listening who might not know, um, Dave Wesley ran this game called Braunstein, which is pretty much a role-playing game, although I know John would have things to say about that in particular. And then Dave Arneson took that and ran it in a fantasy milieu using Gary Gygax's chainmail rules, and then he ran it for Gary Gygax, and Gary Gygax was like, "Hey, let's collaborate on this." And the internet right now seems to have kind of decided, Dave Wesley and Braunstein, that's it. That's the first role-playing game. Uh, and we Dave Wesley, again, you see him at a convention, people love playing in his games, and he I want to say I read in a forum post that he's like, yeah, I created role-playing games. He does say other people did it too, which is a thing I think we're going to get to. But the current internet consensus is Dave Wesley created role-playing games. But of course, I talked to Jon Peterson about this, and John says, "Oh, it's more complicated and there's more going on here than you would know." Because John is the guy who knows all this stuff because he's brilliant at research. So John, what's the first role-playing
Yeah,
game?
so first of all, I have no good answer to that question, right?
That's great. I love it.
Right. So let's start, I guess, with Moreno. Okay, let's start in Vienna. So there was this gentleman named Jakob Moreno who eventually came over to the English-speaking world after certain political difficulties that emerged mid-century in Europe. And it was his term Rollenspiel that became our term role-playing game. And this was something that he explored in two broad contexts, one of which was therapeutic. In other words, the therapeutic value of role playing. And a lot of people today, we constantly see apologists on the internet saying these games like D&D, they aren't just entertainment. You can really help people with them. And, this is something that was kind of built in from the start, I guess, in the sense of role playing technology like this, had been utilized, again, not just for psychotherapy, but also for after Moreno came over to the States, like industrial contexts, business contexts, and as I'll get into in more detail in a minute, kind of political contexts. So that was one aspect to it. But then there was another aspect to it, which is the Stegreiftheater, which is his improvisational theater that he was really into. And this is very much, like Second City, like you show up in a place and, throw contemporary events at people and they like improvise and do these things. And so, this concept of just kind of picking up characters and having this improvisational yes and sort of thing was also part of this from the start. And so, these concepts had just been kind of bouncing around for a while. And, social scientists got interested in them, especially people in what they call the operations research community after the Second World War, when it became clear that kind of conventional tactical doctrines might have less applicability in a world of like nuclear armaments. People at think tanks, at MIT, at UCLA, obviously at Rand, got really interested in the concept of having actors who inhabited the roles effectively of decision makers in states who would interact with one another in conflict or crisis situations. We think about model UNs and things like that that have followed from all this technology, but in the late 1950s, this became very popular. And that's the first place we really see the coinage role-playing game applied to something that is like a conflict simulation game. We see that as early as 1964, where people were using that explicit term, role-playing game, to talk about something where, okay, I'm playing, the Home Secretary of the UK and like your defense, and this is the Prime Minister, and we're all actors, and we're participating in this like simulation with a bunch of other people, and we're expected to stay in our roles. And we certainly have a whole slew of games that would become known to people like IX and Arneson that departed from similar principles. Alan Colomer, who created a game called Diplomacy, which everyone, including Major Wesley and Dave Arneson and everyone else, would be very happy to tell you they were all deeply immersed in. There's a huge paper trail of this at the time. So, the concept, though, that in a game like Diplomacy, and traditionally, this is a game that first came out in 1959, Diplomacy was played around a First World War setting, that kind of the great powers in their detente prior to the First World War, then, encounter different alliances, and that the game is a very deep and wonderful game whose actually 70th anniversary is coming up, not too
I
long now.
mean, have you played a lot of Diplomacy?
In high school, it was one of the board games I really played with my high school club.
Yeah, I play it with my seventh and eighth graders, and I've been playing again. I think I played it for 13 years with kids. Oh God, that game. I mean, it's perfect in its way. I can see why there was a madness for taking it and hacking it for other places and times in Middle Earth and all this. But again, please continue. I'm sorry, I just addendum.
Yeah,
Sidebar.
no. And so, obviously, yes, as you said, it got hacked for a lot of variants that took it into science fiction, that took it into fantasy. And, it's clear that people like Gygax and Arneson knew this stuff at the time. And so this was another factor. And when we talk about what the things were that all kind of the different beams of light that coalesced into the prism of D&D, there's going to be a bunch of factors. That was certainly a factor, and this was the diplomacy side of it. But, I mean, there's just a bunch more that we can identify and point to. Games like that, um, the kind of political war game that was first referred to as a role-playing game. Like Gygax was involved in one of these in '66 that was called the Ad Hoc Committee for the reinstitution of World War II, in which different people, it's kind of a play-by-mail campaign. Again, took on different parts in this. Famously at Gen Con, the Internation Simulation, which is one of the early kind of social science versions of this, was played, in the late 1960s. Yeah, so I mean, this stuff was all just in the air around the people that would go on to be the protagonists in D&D. And, for each of the kind of aspects that we could identify of, how D&D is played or what we think role-playing might be, we can point to various precursors and parallels. Because, of course, the definition of RPGs is often contested. It's difficult to, say, well, any single thing I can point to and say, well, this aspect, is in it. Some people might say, well, that's, you know, sufficient but not necessary, or necessary but not sufficient for something to be an RPG. And so, you can certainly get into a lot of pedantic arguments about that. But if you look at things like, for example, the dialogue, the notion that players state intentions and that referees are then responsible for kind of consulting the rules and responding, okay, as a result of what you just said, here is what happened. Now, we can find precursors of this that go back into the 19th century, into the early 19th century. And indeed, when I was talking about how, I went looking for who was the first person to roll dice against a table of probability to determine whether or not a fictional event happened, the fellow that I blame for that, a guy named Reiswitz, who put out a book in 1824 that helped the Prussian army to kind of plan to train their officers. He had developed a system in which basically officers moved in his war game, in his training exercise, simply by writing orders. They had to write them down and say, like, okay, if I'm the colonel, I want these 40 troops here to like move on to this hill, and I want, this other group over here to, go a mile this way, right? And, you know, the players in his game would write these orders out, would hand them to a referee. The referee would then go and consult maps, and there would be, other players perhaps who were on the opposing side that were inputting similar things, and he would be marking on these maps where everyone's troops are, and would come back and say, okay, what we get back is that your 40 guys reported they came under fire, and they're asking for clarification for what they should do now. And, what Reiswitz wrote about this was that, he hoped that this would put the players in this game in the same position of like uncertainty as a commander would actually be in the field, right? And that this was the value of this as a training exercise. And Indeed, when we talk about Braunstein, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about Wesley's Braunstein games is how they evolved over time. Initially, he had the same stipulation that everyone had to put things in writing. Things had to be written down, and Wesley, as the referee, would have these like notes passed to him, and then he would tell them, okay, this is the result of what happened from you sending that note. But by the end of the 19th century, there was a fellow named Verdi de Vernois who had decided, no, like actually writing all this stuff down, a good referee, someone who actually understands like, the military sciences and has experience in this, so just be able to have a conversation with you. You should be able to talk to them and say, well, like this is what I do. And I'm riding with my troops when we're going to this hill, and 30 says, great, okay, you get there, it's now dusk, what do you want to do now? And that feedback loop of like, what do you do starts to emerge then in Verdi-Vernois. This is in the 1870s. And that technology would then be captured by all these different like military scientists in the early 20th century. Sayer, who translated that into English, McHugh, who was writing about this in the 1950s, largely relying on Sayer, and then picked up by people like Michael J. Corns, who produced a book called Modern War in Miniature in 1966. And if you open Modern War in Miniature and just look at the first page of it, what you will see is a dialogue example of a player and a judge. And, in a game where there are now 2-second turns, and the player is like, okay, I am run down, I'm diving into, this, into this furrow here, and I peek my head up. Do I see the enemy? Yes, you can see him. He's peeking his head around the corner. Okay, I'm shooting at him. Okay, well, and it has that like immediacy to it that we would associate with D&D. You see that in 1966. And we have a couple ways that we know that game spread both into Arneson's circle and into Gygax's circle. Mike Carr, who was famously like the Bishop of Blackmoor. Mike Carr, for example, was on the schedule to play that game at Gen Con in 1971. Um, right around the time that Blackmoor would be starting. And so, and Gygax knew it because he worked on the Tractics rules, and his co-authors on that, Leon Tucker and Mike Reese, huge Corns fans. They wrote a ton about it in the International Federation of Wargaming zines that, Gygax and all the rest of them read around that time. And so again, if what you think is essential to role-playing games, or for something to be a role-playing game, is the notion that there's like a dialogue and there's a player who kind of says, this is what I want to do, and a referee who says, well, this is what happens. We can show you a great history of that. And really think about playing out the role like this is what it does. It just traces back all these things as far as I can take them.
Wow. Yeah. The Corns book is particularly surprising or shocking to me. I just thought I would have heard of that before you pointed it out. And I when I say that, I assume I would have just read something from you about it sooner, which is not to put it on you. I'm saying I, for
I do read about it a lot. I mean, I tried, I mean, people say I write about it too much, and you got to be careful about this, right? I mean, our job as historians is to find a way to talk about this where the influence is not too big, not too small, but just right. And it's hard, right? And like it's a judgment, but like so I'll fall back on what I said before. It's a factor, right? That this is something that was injected into this. These guys all knew this stuff, right? Going into that was not new. Nobody who was associated with the creation of D&D invented the idea that there was going to be a player who just talked to, a referee, and the referee says, "Okay, this is what happens." That is like centuries old tech at the point that D&D came out, at least 100 years old.
and you would trace it all back to uh Prussian military training, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Wow.
Verdi was the first one who brought this down to a dialogue where it wasn't just writing down orders, right? Or at least the first one where we have really documenting that is the right way to do this. And interestingly, with that, comes a lot of latitude and a lot of judgment that referee is allowed to exercise that you might not have seen in some of the earlier games that were much more focused on obeying the rules as they were written. And Verdi de Vernois is much more kind of freeform, actually, than some of the early authors were.
So any reason then that you would give for D&D being the one to take off instead of, say, Modern Warfare and miniature?
Well, so Modern Warfare Miniature is, still intended to be a military simulation. And honestly, if you look at the book, if you look beyond the dialogue examples, you'll find there aren't a lot of rules. I mean, what Corns actually says is, in my game, there is only one rule: simulate reality. And he says, and he gives a whole bunch of tables and ways for you to roll basically percentile dice against real war statistics tables of how effective different weapons will be in different contexts and things like that.
Yeah, he was writing in Leavenworth, right?
What's that?
He was writing in Leavenworth, right? The Army College there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought that you were talking about a prison for some reason, but
Oh,
yeah.
they're in the same place.
Yes.
You know.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure he was actually there at the time he was doing that. I mean, I think he was in and out, but not at the prison,
Yeah,
the military. But yeah, I mean, honestly, and this is a real weakness of my methodology and approach. I go by the documents a lot, and if I don't need to know things about people's biography to understand what I want to understand, because I want to understand how systems evolved,
Hmm.
right? Like, then generally I just won't even know. I've never talked to Corns. I don't even know if he's still alive.
I want to say he passed away and his son is in California. I looked it up because I was like, Jesus Christ, did this guy create role-playing games? And I didn't figure it out. So I did a little sniffing around. So he passed away, but his son is still around. So I guess maybe I'll hunt him down and interview him, unless you beat me to him. Uh, so
I'm happy to leave the interviews to you. I'll just work in the docs, man.
so
But that's not the only one, right? So again,
oh
we're
yeah,
just
go for it.
taking
Please
things
continue.
random. Let's talk about Western gunfight. Western gunfight
Western
is my
gunfight.
favorite, right? Like, so these guys, these are English guys in Bristol, and they started this Western simulation game. They've been working on modern rules, but also this kind of Old West simulation game at least from 1969 forward. I mean, the earliest docs I've seen from theirs that show them playing this are from 1969. They didn't actually publish a version of their rules until 1970. They, wrote about it through very popular wargaming zine called Wargamers Newsletter, run by a guy named Don Featherstone. Featherstone wrote the seminal book War Games that came out in 1962 that introduced a lot of people to kind of war games in both the UK and in the US. But Featherstone's Wargamers newsletter was a publication everybody read. People in Gygax and artisan circles all read it. They were addicted to it. And what these guys wrote in about to Wargamers newsletter was Old West simulations where every player kind of controlled a given character, and they're they developed kind of backstories and bios and statistics and so on, such that you were supposed to play your character the way that your character is written, rather than what, in other words, the more tactically advantageous way of directing them would be. You should play them according to their character instead. And
Can I
the
read a piece that you found about this?
Sure.
So I believe this is from your website. And I forget who's writing this, but quote, I hope this brief article gives readers some idea of what is in store for them in skirmish war games, if they haven't already tried them. The main point I am trying to make is that whilst in the actual game the mechanics are as in any other war game with single figures as units, the approach to setting up the situation and protagonists should be much more detailed than is usually found with conventional games. Having characters with lives of their own who find themselves in situations and then behave in character rather than simply acting in their own best interests adds greatly to the enjoyment of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean this got to a point, and I have a whole thing about this in my book, The Elusive Shift, where they wrote an article that was called, but is it really wargaming? Because by 1973 they had certainly been playing this long enough, and they realized that the objective was no longer for one side to prevail. It was to tell a continuous, ongoing Western story that was engaging, right?
Wow.
And they were concerned that people would read their battle reports from this and would think that they were nuts and that, what they were doing really wasn't wargame anymore. And Elusive Shift, I use this to bookend how, 10 years after, because this, you know, after D&D had come out and after everybody had built all these kind of second generation systems that were competing with D&D, an article was written by someone that was like, yeah, but is it really work? No, is it really role playing? Like this is the joke, right? Is that and nobody could really agree on what the lines of delineation between these things were, which is indeed what the title The Elusive Shift comes from. But,
Now,
the
did the English, did that just spring up all on its own, or can you link that back to, again, the Prussian strand of wargaming?
well, I mean, I'm not sure
I
I
don't
know
know is a great
where
answer.
yeah, I'm not sure I know where they really got it from. I mean, individual level simulations are becoming increasingly popular in the 1960s, playing as individual soldiers versus kind of playing as a commander who would have a bunch of troops that like report to you and you're kind of setting them off as pawns on your chessboard. Um, and it was kind of natural that this would become attached to different genres as it went forward. And Western gunfight just happens to be one that the stories just write themselves, right? You create a couple characters, you create some good guys, some bad guys, create a setting, and the next thing you know, the stagecoaches are being robbed, the bandits are being hunted down across the border. The genre itself just lends itself to the development of campaign stories like that. And taking this thread back now to Braunstein, um, famously, right around the time that the Blackmoor campaign started, in the immediate precursor to it was a variant of Braunstein that was called Brownstone. And Brownstone was indeed a Western simulation, exactly along these lines. Yeah, and we do have some evidence, at least from people who participated in it, that, when kind of pressed on, well, what were the rules you used for this? There was something called like the Western gunfight rules that we got. At least that's how Greg Svensson remembers it. So, I mean, to say again, that does not mean this was in any way determinative. And it's all factors. You got to take diplomacy. You got to take, the Corns, or at least the sources Corns drew on. You've got to take, okay, there are other people who are doing skirmish wargame that's really focused on telling stories. But there's like several more of these that we can roll out after this, right? Like we can look at the Hyborian campaign that Tony Bath had been running for some time in the UK. I mean, by for some time, I mean started in 1957, and had been developing in, if for those not familiar with Hyperia, and the world of Conan that was described by Robert E. Howard, this vast political war game that involved things like characterizations, where you would have individual characters who were given various statistical attributes for things like their intelligence, for things like their leadership abilities, and that these in turn pass down through various ways to people in the Twin Cities. There's a guy in the Twin Cities named Bill Hoyt who had gone to England in 1969 and met up with wargamers there, including a guy named Charles Grant, who then ran a club that was called the Society of Ancients, where Tony Bath had founded this and was kind of the lifetime chairman of it. But Grant was doing the work, especially of getting their publication Slingshot out. And these articles that appeared in Slingshot, like characterization in Hyboria, that describe the state of their how they specify characters in the game, those came down to the Twin Cities through, Bill Hoyt's subscription and circulated there. Like all these people were connected to this broader movement. Again, that we can just see developing in so many different pockets that are all pushing us towards having something that's more immediate, that's more focused on playing characters, more focused on being in character. Um,
I would like to briefly make you uncomfortable with further praise by pointing out that it's amazing not only that you found these games, but that you were able to do the legwork to prove that people in the circles where D&D was created had knowledge of them. Again, you found like Gary Gygax writing about Western gunfight. Um, you're able to link the Hyperborea game to the Twin Cities. I mean, it is stunning and breathtaking uh, in terms of your research. But so please continue. But I just wanted to point out to the audience, Jesus Christ, buy John's books. He has a new one coming out. We'll plug it later, or I guess it recently came out. But please continue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, we could literally do this all night, right? Where we just look at different factors and fight in the skies. Be my next choice, right? And this is Mike Carr again. This the aforementioned Bishop of Blackmoor, a game that he developed in 1968 originally. Actually, played at the first Gen Con, and as far as we know, is the only game that has been played at every Gen Con since.
Ah,
Um, and it would ultimately be published, professionally by first Gaiden Games, then of course by TSR in 1975. Mike Carr came over to TSR as an early employee, was there from 1976 until 1983, and was like general manager. I mean, he was, and then executive vice president. He was very senior in it, and was one of the resources I've worked with most closely, I would say, because his knowledge both of kind of Arneson's work and the Twin Cities work before D&D came out, and then his extensive experience at TSR, just unbeatable. My book Game Wizards could not have happened without his help. I'll say that. But Carr's Fight in the Skies was interesting because it's a World War One aerial combat simulation game. Red Baron, that's what you should be thinking. And but that's a game that's really based on individuals who are pilots. Like every airplane that is involved in a combat, there's one pilot inside it, right? And what Carr encouraged and the community around Fight in the Skies embraced was this idea that you should, write backstories for those pilots. You should determine if they fly aggressively, if they fly conservatively, and you should play them the way that you describe them rather than, whatever will, be the greatest tactical advantage. And this was something that was happening in the Twin Cities really as Braunstein, as Brownstone, as Blackmoor are developing. They're all playing this too. They're all playing this. They're all playing diplomacy. They're playing things like Corns. They're doing all this together, and it's all a mashup. When you look at something like experience, this is a great one. Like I literally can't tell whether the concept of experience point and level was first in Blackmoor or in Fight in the Skies.
oh
They're
wow.
so close in time when these get that it's from the fanzines, and there's this wonderful fanzine called Aerodrome that specified the kind of the addendum to the rules of Fight in the Skies between its various editions. When you see that start to emerge, there were certainly experience systems in Fight in the Skies well before their Blackmoor started. Like in 1970, there were already people that had the concept that you should get X points for shooting somebody down, and if you get shot down, you lose X points, and but that as you go up in points, then you're effectively your skills increase, you fly better, your shooting is more accurate, things like that. But really, when the actual term levels and experience came about, probably I'd say Blackmoor was first. But because it was all the same people doing it, it almost doesn't matter, right? It was like just part of this like broader thing that was going on that everyone was engaged with. You could argue Fight in the Skies was the first role-playing game. You could argue Western Gunfight was the first role-playing game. You could argue that Bath Cyboria was. And you could argue it was far earlier than some of these others were. Um, you could make the case for Corns. I think it's a little weaker just because it is just a military simulation. And you don't see the kind of language like the Western Gunfight people are using, where they're like, look, that your job is to be in character. I don't even know if this is wargaming anymore. We just want to tell cool stories with this game. Like Corns is not that. But if you think it's a sufficient condition for something to be a role-playing game to have that dialogic interface between the players and the referee, like, Corns is your man.
Did I hear you describing innovations in role-playing games as technology during this interview?
You did. I say that a lot, actually. Yeah.
And what makes you classify it as technology?
It actually in the new edition of Playing the World. There, at the end of the second volume, I have a note on methodology, basically. It's called a note on sources, but it's not. It's really like kind of because a lot of people have asked me what my method actually is, or like what historians or philosophers of history actually follow. And so I actually wrote a little bit about that at the end of that. But there one of the things I say in it is that I was really influenced by people who study the evolution of technology in the way that I approach studying game systems. To me, it doesn't really matter if this technology is instantiated in an analog or a digital form.
Hmm.
Um, Things like, hit point systems or just damage mitigation ecosystems, right, that are defined to determine, basically, as I put it in Playing with the World, that are life support systems for your characters. So they are not immediately annihilated, and you have the opportunity to be able to continue to enjoy them while still feeling the risk and desperation of it. Oh, at any moment, I could be snuffed out, but I survived this one. Good for me. Um, yeah, I do view those as technologies. They're in I think the thing that most qualifies them for technologies is the way that they evolve and the way they diversify and the way you see so much experimentation. If you compare the way that, since I know you and I both know Vampire, should we tell people that we actually were both at Boston University almost at the same time? We missed each other
I
by like
mean,
when
it's
I was a grad
weird.
student.
It's a very strange coincidence in my
Yes.
life to be like, yeah, in the 90s you were Drew Meeger's roommate. You played in the Van Helsing Society occasionally, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I ran some of the LARPs there. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean it's I don't know, it's the universe is infinite, and in an infinite universe everything will happen at some point. So maybe I shouldn't think it's as strange as it is, but it's curious that I assume we met at the deli house at some point after a game, if only briefly.
Well,
Um,
yeah.
and but to I don't think we had more than a at best a passing conversation until 20, I'm gonna say 2022, like
Probably.
is gonna be my guess for meeting in person again, giving us like a 24-year hiatus, and we both ended up writing books about D&D,
It
even
is
though we were geeking out playing Vampire.
we're playing Vampire. Well, and Vampire, to bring it back, Vampire
Yeah.
has a very different health system than D&D does, right? Where you have your hit points go up as you go up in level. The notion that you have like soak and concepts like that, right? These are all alternate technologies. And actually one of the things that Playing with the World does is it tries to classify these technologies, at least broadly, in systems, distinguishing, for example, between endurance and mitigation, right? Like endurance is I've got a big pile of hit points, and if I get hit, the number goes down, but I endured that. Whereas mitigation is I have something like shielding, such that if a damage source would come in, it is reduced by the amount of mitigation that I have, right? Like these are technologies. They can be used in concert. They can be used separately. And various systems deploy them in different ways to create different system effects. Now, Arneson famously, went on record saying he didn't think that characters were supposed to get more hit points as they went up in level, and that this was a serious goof on Gygax's part in the design of D&D, or communication miscommunication, a mix-up, communication breakdown, I think was the way he put it, right? Like because you could have a system where effectively your armor class just goes up as you go up in level and become harder to hit. And, if you do the math, you can figure out a way where that works just the same way, right? Where it's just as unlikely that you will be killed in a given encounter as you go up in level, as you get these increases in either endurance or in mitigation. And like those are just technical trade-offs that many subsequent role-playing games and war games have now explored ad nauseum. I mean, there's just, there are so many variations on it that I don't know whose job will be to catalog that. I hope it's not you or me, because that's the tough one.
So, first edition of Playing at the World, how did that see print?
Well, I reached out to a couple people about it. I remember talking to Oxford University Press about it uh, when they heard how long it was. They weren't really interested in doing that. A lot of people suggested if I wrote a much shorter book, that they'd be happy to publish that. I mean, so effectively, I ended up creating a little publishing imprint of my own, and that was called Unreason Press. And Unreason Press existed just to publish Playing at the World. Um, I was very DIY about all of it, and I really kind of leaned into it. Our friend Drew Meager, who you just mentioned, of course, I got him to do some illustrations for the book, just little cartoons that are interspersed throughout it. And really, it was just a set of friends of mine who read it and gave me comments. But, I tried to lay it out as well as one can lay out 420,000 words in a single paperback volume. It's a bit of a challenge. Um, and I basically put it up on Amazon. I think I brought 20 copies of it with me to Gen Con in 2012, which I mostly traded or gave away to people. I mean, I would be happy to give them away to people that I'd written about in it. I can remember Lou Zaki. I tried to give him a copy, and he insisted that I take like the value of the book in dice from him, in exchange for it. So I did get dice from a couple people and things like that. But mostly, yeah, I think the original Playing at the World, the very first edition, the only price that was on it just said 20 gold pieces, I recall. And so I would just like take $20 for it in cash. Um, but then, people got interested in it. I really had no idea, right, what people were going to make of this. I mean, it wasn't something that I imagined would really take off and that a lot of people would read or be interested in. But a couple people did get interested in it. And one of them was Peter Adkison, obviously, who was the founding CEO of Wizards of the Coast and then the owner of Gen Con. He really went to bat for it. A couple of people like that did managed to convince a lot of people to read it. And then the next thing you know is getting invited to do academic anthologies, and to contribute shorter articles about this. And I developed this relationship with MIT Press, who has published most of my crunchy scholarly stuff and will probably continue to do so in the future. Though, talking about the future, and just talking about the early history of G&G, just this kind of period, from 1968 up to whatever the early 80s or maybe the mid 80s in Game Wizards. I don't think I'm going to write about that anymore. I think I've done enough in the last 20 years writing about that. I don't think I really have anything more to say about that at this point.
A quick glance on the internet shows me that the first edition of Playing at the World is going for 170 on Noble Knight Games, 152 on Thrift Books, 130 on Abe Books, and let's see, is it $100 on Amazon? So can I ask what the print run was?
Um, I think it was. I'm not actually sure. I don't
Okay.
want to misspeak, but I mean, it was thousands. Yeah, thousands of copies sold, like some thousands, and but I mean, eventually. I just took it out of print. Like, I mean, and there were a couple of reasons for that. I actually had some, I like licensed stuff from Marvel for this, right?
Holy
Because
shit.
yeah,
I shouldn't
you
swear.
could. Like back in 2010, 2011, actually, I found a permissions person that I work with, and she managed to get Stan Lee's daughter to like sign off on this stuff. I guess she worked for Marvel at the times before, of course, Marvel was sold to Disney, and I wanted panels of like the Mighty Thor and Doctor Strange and things like that, which at the time were relatively obscure properties. This is the thing to appreciate. Like, you know, and so I managed to license, I think for like four things for the entire print run of it, it was like $1,200. You would not get that deal today for doing original Marvel panels in your book. Um, but some things like that were actually on like a timeline that where I had to stop printing it or I'd have to get them renewed.
Yeah.
So it was going to go out of print. And the new version doesn't have nearly as much of that kind of licensed stuff in it, in part because it doesn't need to, because now people know who Doctor Strange and Thor are. Um, but, partly too, I just wanted to have like a different set of images. Like from Braunstein, good example. I mean, when I wrote Playing at the World, I wasn't aware that there were any surviving play artifacts from Braunstein. And, I've been fortunate enough now to find a couple.
Oh
And one
wow.
of the new things that's in the second edition is actually a note from the first Braunstein written by one of the students, but written by student D, who is the son of the Baron. Informing him that he's like been locked up and asking if he can get out of jail, which just all these things that kind of give us, corroboration, I guess, of the way that Dave Wesley has talked about Braunstein for all these years. So it's cool to be able to put things like that in. And Leonard Pat, this is maybe the biggest single failing original Playing at the World is that I missed this set of medieval fantasy rules that Gary Gygax like obviously cribbed from to create the Chainmail Fantasy supplement. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of just kind of different illustrations that I wanted to have in at this time.
And I have to ask, is that Castle Blackmoor over your shoulder?
It is, yeah, the Kibri Castle about Berg Brunsel there.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's not literally like
It's not
artisan,
though, yeah, it's
right?
a.
Yeah, this is a put together Berg Brunsel. Yeah, if you actually look at, I see the Playing at the World 2E V1 behind you over your shoulder. If you look at the castle that's on the right-hand side of that illustration, I asked Erolotus, who did the covers for these, to use Berg Brunsel as kind of the thematic. This is what the castle should look like. Yeah.
I guess I should show the audience. This is what 400,000 words looks like when it is
Yeah.
in printed form. And like you can see the chapters that I was the most interested in and just poured over with
Yeah, they're
notes.
the end ones, the first and fifth one. You're
Yeah.
not the only one, man. So there's original, those middle chapters. Like this is the way that the reorganization of the book has gone. So those two chapters are now the first volume, the one that you see behind you
Yeah.
there. The first and fifth chapters is now a continuous narrative that just says this is the immediate circumstances, the invention of D&D. The middle chapters have all the really crunchy research, all the really how did the concept of sword and sorcery come together? Who were the protagonists in that? What were the elements of that? All that conflict simulation stuff I was talking about. Who decided to roll dice against charts? How those charts evolve? How dialogue-based approaches evolve? How did we start getting down to individual figures and their quantifications? All the things about Hyboria and Midgard. We haven't talked about Midgard yet. Yet another factor we just roll into. This is the main thing I just want to get across. There's one thing to take away from Playing the World. It's that no single person did any of this. No single group did any of this. This
So
was
this
a movement. And like any, it's like punk rock. You're going to look at the 70s and be like, oh, who was the first punk rock band? And we could sit here and have a 3-hour argument about this, right? Oh, should this qualify? I mean, is it really was the MC5? Yeah, kick out the jams. Was that not the first punk rocks?
I mean, that's a really good track.
It is a solid track. But point being, no, it's got to be the Ramones. No, it's got to be Sex Pistols. No, it's got to be television. I mean, take your pick, right? And what should the necessary and sufficient conditions be? You can never really just decide these things, and um, Playing the World doesn't try to do that. I guess that's maybe the thing I'm most proud of about it. It doesn't try to fix it. It doesn't try to say this is the one thing that did this, or this is because it's all too messy. And I am someone who's perfectly content to let it be messy because life is messy, right?
This is
Yeah.
going to be a great episode. I'm going to title this "What Was the First Role-Playing Game?" And people are going to listen to it for an hour, and then they're going to be like, "God, they didn't even give us an answer." But and yet,
Well,
that how often is that life, right? Like,
what's your opinion? I mean, you've
I
heard
mean,
me rant about this.
you're the expert, and I would defer to your wisdom in that the answer is it's a movement. I think it's a movement is a great answer. Um, and especially given that we've talked about this for an hour now, and you have laid out all these factors, and again, I just come back to being really impressed by your ability to demonstrate, not just that there was a group in England telling narrative stories in the Old West, but that the Arneson Circle in the Twin Cities was aware of it, and maybe even used it in Brownstone. Uh, so to say, you know, I think Braunstein is the Braunstein is the internet answer of the moment. Like Dave Wesley is having a real renaissance. Again, he's still alive, which gives him the ability to go to conventions and he can run Braunstein for people. And they will then go and make YouTube videos where they're like, I learned how to finally properly play D&D by playing Braunstein. And it is great to kind of do an attempt at game archaeology. I'm sure you can argue how much what happens at these conventions actually is similar to what Wesley did. Uh, but you know, I would defer to you
I mean,
in your wisdom that it's a movement and not a single event and single person.
and it was enormously valuable to me back in 2008 when I played in Wesley's reconstructions of Braunstein 1 and 4 at Gen Con. And, I mean, it's, of course, I recommend it to everyone. Everyone should do it. Everyone should listen to everyone, right? Like, don't just listen to me. Everyone should listen to everyone. Nobody's going to have 100% of the story about any of this. Um, I guess the only caveat I have is just, don't only just listen to one person. Especially me, right? Listen to a bunch of people, and I think you get the best perspective from shopping around.
Well, that is one of the beauties that there's now a diversity of voices talking about this matter. So, Playing at the World Volume 2 is available now everywhere.
It's available now, right? I have one here. Oh, look at this.
Woohoo!
This is the other Aero Lotus cover. So it's like we call it the three pillars for setting, system, and character. So I asked Daryl to do one that had like three, silos that would express this is supposed to be like a German Prussian guy here with his charts and his dice, and the setting is like a fantasy place, and there's like characters. So yeah.
Well, let me ask you this in closing. What is your favorite book that you've written?
The elusive shift. I mean, I say this a lot, I guess. I mean, everybody tells me Game Wizards is the book that's actually readable, right? It is. It
I
is.
don't think that's fair. I think I find Playing at the World very readable, and like I have Elusive Shift. I just haven't read it yet. But like, I would not describe that any of your work as being unreadable. But please continue.
I was just saying, so elusive shift because it also I just had a lot of time to do it, and I kind of got to do it the way I wanted. It's the most just from an argument perspective, I guess, from the way it's structured. It's the most like I'd like my books to be structured.
Hmm.
So I think it's the most successful in terms of what I want my books to do. But I mean, there's playing at the world because it is casting such a wide net. It's necessarily messy, but I think it's essential. I mean, we need something like it. We need something that is just going to sit there and lavish 50 pages on how did the experience system come together, right? Like, because if we don't have that, then because experience that's had long legs. I mean, that's a really major like cultural innovation of the late 20th century. Like, somewhere you have to be willing to detail like in excruciating like depth how it is that something like that came about.
Well, everybody, go buy a Jon Peterson book if you never have. Um, Choose anyone you want. They're all delights. Uh, John, I cannot thank you enough for taking an hour to talk. It's been illuminating and amusing as it always is. I'm constantly learning every time I hear you open your mouth, so it's great.
Well, thanks so much for having me. We've been meaning to do this for a while, and I'm glad that we finally managed to make it happen. I can come on and visit with your show, and best to you as well with your projects.
Thank you very much. And next time, I'm going to try and get you on with Shannon Appelkline. I have no idea what we would talk about, but that would be a great hour if it was
That
you,
would be a
Shannon,
great
and me.
hour. We should.
So,
Should.
I'll
Okay.
try and get it. I'll try and make it happen. You have a good spring, sir, and I'll see you at Gen Con.
Sounds great. See you there.
Bye bye.